All right, in this unit we're going to turn to Marxism and its impact on philosophy of education and education. Marxism, of course, is named for Karl Marx, 19th century social thinker, certainly famed as a political thinker and economic thinker, more broadly speaking, though his PhD was originally in philosophy, and it was from a philosophical perspective that he nested all of his subsequent social, political, and economic activist and theoretical thinkings. I think it's safe to say that if we had looked at the future of the world by the time Marx died toward the end of the 19th century, in the 1880s, no one would have predicted that Marxism would have come to have the impact on 20th century theory and practice that he did. Marx was at that point a little-known German thinker, one of many activist thinkers at the time. And at the time of his death, he had not succeeded in generating a mass movement of the sort that was to come in the 20th century. But early in the 20th century, all of that did change, and it changed spectacularly with fatal implications for 20th century history. 1917, a small group of revolutionaries inspired by Marxist philosophy and political philosophy, led by Lenin and a group of others, including Stalin and Trotsky, succeeded in overthrowing Russia and transforming feudal Russia into communist Soviet Union. And with that revolution, Marxism was launched as perhaps the most successful political philosophy over the course of 20th century, especially in terms of population numbers. By the end of World War II, the Soviet Union succeeded in adding to its control most of Eastern Europe. Marxist revolutionaries had also succeeded in taking China in a communist direction led by Mao Zedong. And so by the time we get to the middle part of the 20th century, Russia and China are now political systems based explicitly on Marxist political philosophy. Also by the middle part of the 20th century, if we take a snapshot around the world, a number of other revolutions are coming online in a Marxist direction or already have done so. It's a great battle in the Korean Peninsula that leads to a split between a southern Korea that is more liberal and democratic and a North Korea that is still to this day communist in its ideology. The same thing played out in Asia, in Cambodia, and other Southeast Asian nations. Closer to home here in the United States, a number of Marxist-inspired revolutionary groups are active in Latin and South America. A very successful revolution occurs in Cuba, just off the coast of the United States. And in Africa, a number of Marxist-inspired revolutions occur as well in states such as Angola, Mozambique, and a few others. So if we again take a snapshot of the world in the middle part of the 20th century, if you consider that China, of course, is the world's largest country in terms of population, Russia adds its own hundreds of millions of people, and if we add Eastern Europe and then the densely populated countries of North Korea, Vietnam and Cambodia and so on, it's fair to say that perhaps 2/3 of the world's population by the middle part of the 20th century is living under political regimes that are directly inspired by and putting into practice ideas generated by Karl Marx in the 19th century. We can also, in a qualified sense, add countries like India to the mix. India, after achieving independence after World War II, politically went in a more democratic direction, but economically was strongly socialistic, and many of the economic thinkers, including the political leadership in India, were Marxist in their economic thinking or very close to Marxist in their economic thinking. Again, India, the world's second largest country in terms of population, would add then significantly to the number of people in Earth who are living under Marx or nearly Marxist-inspired regimes. Now, in the United States, where I am speaking from, Marxism has also exerted influence, not so much in terms of succeeding in causing political revolutions, although there have been significant elements of Marxist political thought work their way into American politics. But if we focus more narrowly in education, Marxist political philosophy and Marxist philosophy more broadly speaking has had a great impact in the course of American higher education. Certainly in humanities departments, to some extent in social science departments, surprisingly not so much in economics departments, but certainly in sociology departments, in history departments, in philosophy, political science rather, departments. And then for most of the second part of the 20th century, philosophy departments and literature departments had their share of Marxist thinkers as well. And that then exerted trickle-down effect to the high schools and to some extent to the K through 8 age levels. So let's start philosophically, as we should do in a course in philosophy of education, and explore what Marxism is as a philosophical system. As I mentioned, Marx's degree, his doctoral degree was in philosophy, so he does have a thorough understanding of the history of philosophy and the philosophical issues, and he does have a well worked out systematic philosophy that he applies into all areas of human life. Now, I'm going to take the phrase scientific socialism as my organizing phrase for our discussion here. That's a self-descriptive phrase that Marx and his colleague Engels used in describing their system. They are committed socialists, but they're also committed to science, science being the modern and new way of thinking, and their use adding that adjective, scientific, to the socialism is important from their perspective in talking about the history of socialism and positioning their approach to socialist theory and practice against the modern history of socialism. Their major contrast here is to what they called the utopian socialist movement, which had, from their perspective, been largely ineffectual in bringing socialism about. And from their perspective, utopian socialism, while the ideals of socialism from their perspective were perfectly fine and legitimate, and the commitment of the individuals who were utopian socialists were perfectly fine, the utopian socialists were mostly theoretical individuals, mostly, if we put it in terms of stereotype, students and fellow travelers who would sit around in cafes and sketch castles in the sky, but did not have a scientific understanding of human nature, of how the world actually worked, much less a technology or a set of techniques or a strategic plan for bringing out a socialist revolution, and so they were doomed to failure. What the Marxists then are arguing is, with Marx at the forefront of this, is that socialism as a political and economic expression, right, of a philosophy, or if it is going to be applied, must be put on a firm scientific footing, that is to say, with a proper understanding of the actual nature of reality and with a firm understanding of human nature. Only if we have a proper scientific understanding integrated with a socialist political economy can we hope to succeed in bringing about a socialist transformation of society. So let's take the scientific part of scientific socialism. What is it to be scientific? Here the Marxists are not particularly original in their thinking. What Marx does is take a fairly ruthless and reductive approach to metaphysics and argue that the world is a material system and a reductively material system. What this then means is, metaphysically, from the get-go, the Marxists have no truck with any sort of religion or any sort of a supernaturalistic understanding of reality as is. The world is a material system, and it's governed according to strictly deterministic material laws. And so all of the laws of physics, all of the laws of chemistry, and so forth are the governing structure of the universe. And this is going to have important implications for the role that religion plays in our understanding of politics. They will argue that religion is not only false and to be dismissed, but because of the history of philosophy, people have mistakenly incorporated religious metaphysics into their philosophical systems and hence into their cultural systems. There's going to be a certain amount of work that's necessary to rid society of religious metaphysics in order to start afresh here. So the world operates according to material laws, and the human being is then no exception to this. If we're going to understand human beings scientifically, we have to understand human beings as a materialistic system, subject to laws of physics, laws of biology, and so forth. The Marxists then do not take the biological approach here. Instead, what they argue is, of course, there's a biological package here, but like the behaviorists a little bit later, what the Marxists are going to do is argue that it is primarily environmental forces and environmental material conditions that are the primary determining factors in what a human being becomes. So human beings do have a biological inheritance, a biological package that they are born with, but again, it is a plastic biological inheritance, and it can be molded and shaped in pretty much any direction depending on the social and environmental forces that a human being is subject to. Let me read a couple of quotations to you here from Marx on this particular score. This is from a relatively early piece by Marx called A Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Law, where Marx says, quote, "The human essence has no true reality." Right? The human essence has no true reality. That is to say, there is no such thing as an essence, right, to human nature. A human being at birth is nothing in particular. Instead, the human being is, to put it in one kind of language, a mere set of potentialities. To put it in other language is plastic. To put it in other language is tabula rasa. That is to say, it is a set of raw materials. There is nothing there but a set of raw materials that can then be manipulated and so forth. Another quotation, quote, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their lives, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness." Now, your consciousness is your awareness, right, of reality, your awareness of your own thoughts, feelings, and so forth. But what Marx then is saying is that the content of your consciousness, your thoughts, your feelings, your beliefs, your memories, right, and so forth, those are not something that are unique to you, original to you, or that are self-generating in any way. Instead, what is going on in your consciousness is a product of or a reflection of external reality, right, and more particularly your social reality. So the world around you, your environment, the society in which you are raised, that is what shapes and conditions your consciousness, rather than the causal direction being the other way around. Okay, now, of all of the environmental factors, the Marxists are unique in singling out economic forces or material, business, and economic forces as the fundamental social forces of all. If we're an environmental determinist in general, we can argue that all sorts of things impinge upon us, or all sorts of things in the environment can shape our identity, who we are, the geography in which we're living, whether we live near the ocean, whether we live in the mountains, whether we live on the plains. Religions are a part of society, laws are a part of society, artistic endeavors and various other cultural activities are part of society, and so forth. So we could say all of them equally or in various mixes are the things that impinge upon us and shape our consciousness. What the Marxists, though, argue is that of all of those environmental forces and social forces, it is economic forces that are foundational. They are the substructure, and everything else is a superstructure. So they occupy a particular place within the spectrum of people who advocate environmental determinism by giving primacy to environmental forces that are economic in nature. And here's another quotation from Marx on this point here. This will be a longer one. Quote, "The way in which men produce their means of subsistence depends first of all on the nature of the actual means of subsistence they find in existence and have to reproduce. This mode of production must not be considered simply as being the production of the physical existence of the individuals. Rather, it is a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. As individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and with how they produce. The nature of individuals thus depends on material conditionings determining their production." The most basic thing we do is put food on the table, right, to feed ourselves and to feed our families and others. That is the most fundamental defining characteristic of our being. All of us, of course, are born into a society that has already in place a particular mode of economic production. That becomes then the primary determining factor shaping who we become as individuals. Everything else then is secondary. Law, politics, art, philosophy, religion, all of the rest of the apparatus of culture, the Marxists argue, is important in shaping us, but it itself is shaped fundamentally and given form and content by the underlying economic mode of production that dominates in that particular society. Quotation, again from Marx here. The phantoms formed in the human brain are also, pause right there just for a moment. Notice what we're talking about, thoughts, ideas, and so forth. Those are just phantoms, right, in the human brain. The Marxists are epiphenomenalists, to use a technical term here. It's really, again, the external material forces that cause certain activities to happen in the brain. The thoughts that we have are byproducts, right, or phantoms of that underlying causal process. So let me start again here. The phantoms formed in the human brain are also necessarily sublimates of their material life process, which is empirically verifiable and bound to material premises. Morality, religion, metaphysics, all the rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness, thus no longer retain the semblance of their independence. Pause again in the quotation. Morality, religion, all the rest of ideology, that is to say philosophy, thoughts we have, those have no independence whatsoever. They are totally derived from underlying material processes. Picking up the quotation again, they, that is to say morality, religion, and the rest of ideology, have no history, no development, but men developing their material production and their material intercourse alter, along with this, their real existence, their thinking. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. End quote. All right, so in our phrase scientific socialism, we've talked about the first half of the phrase here, that is the scientific part, and the elements are importantly first metaphysically, we have to understand the world as a material system, as a thoroughly material system, reductively material, that is to say there is no spiritual, no supernatural, no religious dimension to existence. All of that is fantasy. And then we understand the human being as a subset, right, of material systems as well. So we are, when we understand the human beings operating according to a reductively materialistic understanding, all of the thoughts and so forth that we have, feelings and so forth, should be explained not in terms of any sort of autonomous or independent sort of existence, but rather as expressions of underlying material forces. If we then take those material forces and ask which of them are fundamental in explaining our human identity, the choice is between understanding biological material forces as primary or environmental material forces as primary. For the Marxists, it's environmental forces that are primary, not biological ones, environmental determinism. And then if we take the environment, right, broadly speaking, there are any number of environmental forces that act upon us or impinge upon us. What the Marxists then want to do is say of all of those environmental and social forces that are operative, it is going to be economic forces that are the most basic, the most fundamental. They are the substructure, and then everything else that exists socially is then going to be explained as a derivative or secondary causal force here. So up here we can say, for example, that a culture's legal system, right, or more broadly speaking, its political set of structures, its art, its religion, its philosophy, and so forth, all of these things that are cultural forces, and all of us are born into a society that has a particular set of beliefs and practices in these areas here. All of them can be reduced to and seen as expressions of an underlying set of economic forces. So it's economics that's basic, that gives rise to a superstructure that is social, that then as a package expresses itself deterministically, informing the human being's psyche, all of it then operating in a broadly materialistic sort of system. So economic forces, just to put the arrow in here, are more fundamental. These are then derivative. All right, so the general claim is that economic material circumstances underlie everything that goes on in a culture or society, more broadly speaking. And those things all in turn socially determine our individual consciousness. I want now to take religion as a working example, in part just to explain this theoretical point, but also to set up for the Marxist analysis of how religion is working itself in our contemporary political economy. So for a short-range example and a longer-term as far as this lecture goes here. So the claim then should be that if we look at any culture's economic conditions most fundamentally, we should be able to see the religious views, the beliefs, the practices, the rituals, the overall theology as an expression of those underlying economic conditions, perhaps as a ritualization, as a justification for, as a way of capturing intellectually and ideologically what is basically a material set of forces operating in the world. So let's sample a few historical cultures to see how the Marxists would look at them. Take a primitive hunter-gatherer economy. The way we make our living in this particular case is by hunting. To say the men go out and do the hunting, the women do the gathering. So we have a traditional division of labor here. And so what we as men are trying to do then is find various sorts of prey animals and kill them in order to sustain our lives. So economically then, the way we put food on the table, the way we organize our work life is through hunting. Now, what's important to us here as hunters? Well, a couple of things. One thing that's important is a certain amount of knowledge and being able to predict where the various prey animals are going to be, what their habits are, and so forth. But also what's important is that if we're going to be successful as hunters, we have to have the successful traits that predators have in order to be able to successfully catch the prey and bring them to the dinner table, right, so to speak. Now, the Marxists will then point out, if you look at hunter-gatherer societies in history without exception, if you look at the religions of those hunter-gatherer societies, what kind of beliefs, what kinds of practices, right, and so forth are universal to all of them? Well, religions, of course, have beliefs in various kinds of animating spirits and forces and supernaturalistic things and so forth, but what kinds of spirits are then central to the religions of hunter-gatherer societies? And it's no accident then that they will say that we have, well, the bison spirit or the lion spirit or the spirit of the bear or the spirit of the eagle or the hawk. And so all of the spirits that are important are spirits that are exemplars of being certain sorts of prey animals or certain sorts of predator animals. And so what we are then concerned with is trying to divine in our religious rituals, for example, what the bison spirit is planning, right? So on the basis of that, we can then predict where the bison is going to be. So the religion in that particular case, the channeling of the bison spirit and having a medicine man or having a shaman who can claim to be able to do this successfully, that is going to be something that is serving a valuable role to us economically speaking, because it reduces a certain amount of the uncertainty associated with our way of life. Similarly, we will, for example, have rituals. If I'm a young boy and I'm on the cusp of manhood, one of the things that will be important for me to be a man is to be able to prove that I am a successful hunter, and so there are going to be certain sorts of physical things that I have to do. But in many cases, actually almost all cases, cultures that are hunter-gatherer tribes will ritualize this passage from being a boy to being a fully fledged man who's a hunter in the tribe. And so the spiritual elements here involve, for example, say going out and independently killing a predator animal. And whichever predator animal I succeed in killing, I will then take something from it that I put in an amulet form, and that then becomes my totem. So if I kill a lion, right, then the lion becomes my totem, and I'll have a certain number of rituals that I will engage in to try to imbibe the spirit of the lion. And for example, when I'm then going out on a big major hunt, I will engage in certain sorts of rituals and practices that try to draw or empower the lion spirit within me in order to be able to go out and be successful as a hunter. Now the point here is that the fundamental thing that is really driving the, not the ship here, but driving the hunt, so to speak, is we need to make a living in a certain way. We are hunter-gatherers. There are lots of uncertainties, lots of difficulties associated with that economic mode of life. Our religion, though, is an expression of our underlying activities, economically speaking. It captures our uncertainties and tries to manage those. It formulates in a theoretical fashion, in an ideological fashion, our practices and justifies those and so on. So in this case here, the religion simply reduces to being an expression of underlying economic modes. If by contrast, we're not hunter-gatherers, say, on land, but we are hunter-gatherers on the sea. We're fishing peoples. Perhaps we have small boats that we have devised technologically to be able to go out into the waters. Well, then if we ask what kind of religious practices are going to be natural and normal there, and what do we find in fishing cultures? Well, we do find gods and goddesses of the water. Most of the major animals that live in the water, the fish and the other creatures there, have certain kinds of spirits. There are weather gods and so forth. Our religion then is cast in a much more nautical and water kind of direction. If we think about more advanced cultures, right, historically speaking, cultures that are no longer simply hunter and gathering, but say have discovered agriculture, well, what happens to the religions as cultures evolve from being hunter-gatherers to being agriculturally based economies? Well, then we have now the sun god becoming very important, the rain god becoming very important, various kinds of gods and goddesses associated with the crops. The earth herself becomes a goddess, and as we have any number of anthropomorphized beings that we come to believe in, think in terms of, engage in rituals, right, and so forth. So we have worship toward the sun god, and the sun then becomes anthropomorphized in that particular direction because of the absolute importance of the sun to generating the heat and light and so forth that is necessary to our mode of living. The interaction between the rain god and the earth goddess is absolutely important. It's not an accident, right, historically, that the rain personified as always male and the earth personified as always female. The clouds from which the rain come lie on top of the earth and sprinkle water right upon her to fertilize it, and it's from the body of the earth as from the body of the woman that life comes forth. And so what we then have in agricultural economies is a whole set of religious beliefs, a whole set of religious practices and rituals that again give expression to underlying economic concerns and are a rationalization or an ideologicalization of those underlying economic practices. So the argument then the Marxists will do is generalize. Just as religion is a superstructure or secondary phenomenon based on underlying economic forces, everything else that goes on in the culture, a similar sort of story would need to be told as well. All right, let's now turn to the socialism side of the scientific socialist equation and develop the logic here. The Marxists are, of course, determinists. They argue that the cause and effect relations, the material forces that are operating in the universe, economics among them being the most fundamental, play out in certain necessary stages, and that human being or the human being's entire history, right, can be explained in terms fundamentally of the underlying logic, dialectic logic in their case, of economic forces working themselves out. Human beings, of course, have a long history, so to speak, and have gone through various economic stages, and the current stage that we are in is not the final stage, but we are certainly approaching, from the Marxist perspective, one of the great cataclysmic moments, one of the near final stages in the overall ultimate development of the human society and human economy. So if we just, in fairly crude terms, look at human history in economic terms, the first and primary mode of organization is a tribal, mode of organization. We have small hunter-gatherer bands, and they organize themselves in tribal structures. They can be small, just a few families. They can be large, and so forth. What then happens is there's a logic to the development here, and then at a certain point we develop into various sorts of empires, in which one tribe will succeed in bringing a number of tribes under its purview, and then we start to have a more larger organization. Geographically speaking, there's typically an urbanization that occurs here. There will be one basically urban center that will be the capital, and it will have an urban dynamic, and then there'll be a number of smaller centers, but still a large number of agriculture, and perhaps even still hunter-gatherers under their dominion. The next major stage is that the empires become formalized and rigidified into a certain set of structures that we know as feudalism. This is something that happened in Asian countries, Chinese feudalism, Japanese feudalism, the feudal structure in India, and then certainly there are any number of feudal structures that came to exist in Europe as well. Feudalism is very hierarchical, and out of feudalism there's a necessary logic that develops into capitalism. Early in the modern world, we know that there are a number of revolutions that occur that undermine and overthrow feudalism, and so currently we are in the capitalist stage of development. And the Marxists argue that capitalism has its own internal logic of development, economically speaking, and it will give rise to another kind of revolution, a future revolution, though one that may be in the offing from the Marxist perspective, and that will usher in an era of socialism, and socialism will have a couple of substages as well. But to keep it simple, we will have this structure in place for now. All right, now the important point here from the Marxist philosophical perspective is that this development, this economic development, is an ironclad development. They see it as an expression of the underlying metaphysics. The metaphysics is materialistic. The laws that govern material processes development are themselves deterministic, and so there's a necessary logic, so to speak, that the human history has to go through these stages, and so it is only a matter of time before the economic logic of capitalism works itself out, and there is a revolution that brings socialism about. And I have a quotation here from Marx to that effect here. On, quote, the natural laws of capitalist production, unquote, and then picking up a quote again a little bit later, it is a question of these laws themselves, of these tendencies working with iron necessity towards inevitable results. The country that is more developed industrially, that is to say, countries that are in later stages of capitalism here, only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. So again, I'm emphasizing the deterministic element of Marxism here. Now, we are in the capitalist phase in terms of human history. If the Marxists look at the world, they say obviously some cultures are still more feudal, some parts of the world are still empires, some parts even are still tribal. So it's not the case that all humans are homogeneously developing right at the same stage, but nonetheless it is the capitalist countries that are the most advanced economically, and it's in the capitalist countries that we can most clearly see the economic logic working out that is going to bring the socialism that the Marxists are in favor of. So what I want to do next is have a closer look at how capitalism came to be from the Marxist perspective, what its internal logic is, and what's necessary for capitalism to evolve or revolve. Actually, it's going to be a revolution that's necessary here to bring about socialism. That said, I want to temporarily erase the socialism here. and fill in a number of substages within the, broadly speaking, capitalist logic of development here, and we'll bring the socialism back in at the appropriate developmental stage. All right, so capitalism developed out of feudalism. Feudalism, as we know, is a system that is based on hierarchy. That is to say, we have the king or the religious authority who's at the top, sometimes struggle between those two there. Then we have the rest of the aristocracy. We may have a small class of freeholders or yeomen, a number of guilds perhaps, and then the broad mass of the population, though, is the peasantry, right, or the serfs. And all of the economic power, all of the political power, even all of the moral authority and so forth is at the top of the hierarchy, and those who are lower down in the hierarchy have whatever it is that they have by the leave of those who are higher up in the hierarchy. So what we have then is a class-based system, and one's position in the overall social structure is dependent upon what class one happens to be born into, and everybody, wherever they are in the hierarchy, is in a position of being bound, right? It's a class-bound structure. You're born, again, with some exceptions here, you're born into a certain class, you are bound to that class for life, and all of your obligations and all of your responsibilities are then inhere upon you or attached to you by nature of the portion of the class that you are bound into. All right, what then happens is there's a series of capitalist revolutions in the early modern world, and feudalism is overthrown in much of Europe over the course of a couple of centuries here. And of course, under the case of capitalism, everybody is held to be equal in their rights, and rather than people being bound, they are they're rather held to be free, right, individuals. And so we have the emancipation of the serfs, we have the breakdown of the class structure, we have the institution of the idea that all of the laws of the land should apply equally to everybody. There shouldn't be a class-based structure. Everybody should be free to pursue their own mode of living, engage with other people socially by whatever choice that they want to make, and so forth. All right, so what we then have is an emergence of a system that is the exact opposite of the system that it grew out of. But there is nonetheless still a logic to the economic development of capitalism because of its particular institutions, which are different than the feudal ones. And the Marxists argue that given that logic, socialism is something that is necessarily going to develop. So let's take the economic principles that capitalism puts in place. Of course, under feudalism, there was very little by way of property rights, or as to say, there was one person legally, the king, who owned all of the property, including all of the people, or there was a relatively small percentage of the population that was legal entitled to own property. Instead, what capitalism does is it enshrines the notion of private property. Everybody is allowed to, right, free to own property. In some cases, the property that existed under feudalism might be broken up. The huge landed estates that the aristocrats owned, or that the church owned, or that the king owned. When those individuals and groups are deposed, the huge amounts of property then are taken up and divided amongst people. And to the extent that that's done formally, there's a rough and ready equality in the division of labor, or of the division of the property that goes on. So we have private property that comes into existence, and that's an essential feature of capitalism. But we also have in capitalism a system of competition. Right? Those who own property are in competition with each other to try to increase the amount of property that they have. And there's a logic then to the development of competition in a capitalist society that the Marxists think is ironclad. Suppose, for example, we'll do this as a hypothetical experiment here, or as a thought experiment. Suppose we do have a society that is feudal. The king owns all of the land, and suppose there was a perfectly administered revolution in the capitalist direction. We go through and we abolish all of the class distinctions. That is to say, we make everyone equal in their rights. We make everyone free. Everyone is released from their class-based bondage situations. And we take all of the property that the king owned and we divide it up equally among everybody in the society. So we then have a new society that is perfectly free and perfectly equal. Well, what is necessarily then going to happen, though, if we have a private property system that capitalism then brings into case? Well, of course, people will make different decisions about how they're going to use their property. Some people will have better ideas than other people. Some people will have innovative ideas. Some people will be luckier than various other people. Some people will, of course, cheat and get away with it, and that will give them various sorts of advantages. So there will be all sorts of things that go on in the capitalist competition as people are using their private property. And what then is going to happen, though, is in the competition, there are going to be some people who are fairly successful at the capitalist competition. They will be winners, they will be amass more wealth, and there will be those who are losers, so to speak. They will make bad decisions, or they will have bad luck, all right, or they will be victims of various sorts of underhanded practices by other people in that situation. So capitalism, the Marxists argue, is necessarily a zero-sum, or it's a system that generates a series of winners and a series of losers. Now what of course happens is if I, for example, am a loser, I don't know, suppose I make some bad decisions on my land and my crops are a failure for 3 years in a row, then I face bankruptcy. My only option when I face bankruptcy is to sell off my property or it's taken away from me. And so then I lose my property. Somebody else who did not make those same bad decisions or who had better luck, that person then has more assets available to him, so he's in a position to buy my property. But then the end result of that is that I'm a propertyless person, and that person, the other person now has twice as much property, say, so to speak. And my only option then, if I'm going to stay in existence, is to go to work for him. So the argument that the Marxists make is that the logic of capitalism generates then a class structure of its own. Those who are consistently winners become property owners, and the Marxists give the label bourgeois, or the bourgeoisie, right, as a class to those who, as a result of the logic of capitalism, end up being owners of property. And then those who are consistently losers, those who are not in a position then to maintain their own property but have to give up their property and then go to work for the bourgeoisie, those are the proletariat. And so what the Marxists argue is that we might start from a situation in which everyone is equal and free, but nonetheless we are going to evolve necessarily by the logic of capitalism into a situation where not everyone is equal and also not everyone is fully free anymore, because if the bourgeoisie own the property and the proletariat are going to work for them, then the proletariat, particularly when they're on the job, they have to do what the bourgeoisie say. These guys are the bosses, or these guys become the managers. These become the workers who have to do what we say. So we have within capitalism then the development of a hierarchy of its own sake. Now between these two classes there is necessarily going to be a conflict. And the conflict comes from competing economic interests. If I'm a member of the proletariat and I'm working for you, who is a member of the bourgeoisie, it's to my interest to earn more money, but it's to your interest to pay me less money. And so we have a conflict over wages. It's also the case that when I'm on the job, since I'm a human being, I don't necessarily like being told what to do, but you have the right and the power on the job to tell me, right, what to do. So I feel a certain amount of resentment at being told what to do. But at the same time, we know there are a significant number of people in the bourgeoisie who kind of like looking down on people who are in the proletariat and enjoy, right, telling them what to do. Now the conflict between the two classes starts off fairly gently, right, in one generation, but what happens over the course of succeeding generations is the class conflict becomes exacerbated and more extreme. For example, if I am working for you and I'm making my my low wages, well, my kids, when they come along, I'm not going to be able to afford to send them to the first-rate schools that you can afford to send to your kids because you're a member of the bourgeoisie. So your kids will get better education than my kids. I might have to have my kids go to work at a younger age. You can afford the additional luxury of time to send your kids to college, right, and so forth. And so what that then means is economically economically, my kids will be disadvantaged relative to your kids, right, in the next generation. And there are lots of other social factors, right? Your kids grow up and they get to their teen years and it turns out that their teeth are crooked. Well, you can afford to take them to the dentist and have them get braces and orthodontia work and so forth. And so they end up with beautiful teeth. My kids, by contrast, they grow up and they get to their teen years and they have crooked teeth. Well, I don't have the money to send them to the dentist to get them to have beautiful teeth, right, and so on. And so that then limits my children's likelihood of success in the social arena or anything that involves a certain amount of appearances as well. And then, of course, you're only interested in having your kids associate with and marry children of other people who have money. And my kids then feel excluded from the marital race in that particular way as well. Of course, there's also the fact that once you have a certain amount of capital built up, it's easier then for you to invest that money, and so you can go on and get more and more money. We are still stuck in low-paying jobs, and it's very hard for us to get ahead. We're living paycheck to paycheck, so to speak. And so what we have here is a situation where there is antagonism, certainly over money issues, over social hierarchy issues, and it only becomes more extreme. We've heard the saying that the rich then are able to get richer, and the poor get poorer. What we then get is a vicious cycle, right, of all of this. The private property becomes concentrated in fewer hands. The competition, right, becomes more intense. There's a sorting out among the winners themselves. They continue to compete against each other. Of course, there's an emerging middle class, but through the logic of this winner and loser competition, some of the middle class manage to claw their way up into the upper reaches of the bourgeoisie. Others make a mistake at some point and they get pushed down into the proletariat. And then over the course of several generations, the polarization, right, between the classes and the antagonism between the classes becomes more and more extreme. Now, the Marxists then argue that the next thing that will happen, right, necessarily is a revolution. The proletariat, as their masses increase, will come vastly to outnumber the small number of bourgeoisie who are controlling all of the property in a given society. The antagonism between the two classes will become explicit, overt, and inescapable, right, and obvious to everyone. At a certain point, the proletariat will realize that they vastly outnumber, that there's a great deal of strength in numbers. They will be able to conceptualize and realize explicitly that the rich are getting richer at the expense of the poor, that they're not getting ahead, and they will essentially decide that they're not going to take any more. They will rise up and they will overthrow the system, and they will then institutionalize a new kind of society, a socialist kind of society, although there will be some sub-steps necessary here, and that will, of course, be socialism, which we call it, right, broadly speaking. But what the Marxists of the 19th century and the early 20th century in particular are concerned with is the fact that while the antagonisms are developing and while the class conflict is going along, it's not going along quickly enough for them. And despite a number of predictions of imminent revolution, a number of those revolutions fizzled out or did not materialize. There's a question from the Marxist theoretical perspective toward the end of the 19th century, especially about what else might be operative in society such that we're slowing down the revolution. And of course, there's also a debate within broadly socialist circles about whether we need to have a revolution. Why not? If there's a necessary logic here, we don't just let the logic evolve, right, however long it takes. And rather than having a revolution, which is, of course, going to be nasty and so forth, why not just have an evolution, right, toward socialism? What the Marxists want to argue is, given their understanding of human society and the broader economic forces at work here, it has to be a revolution, but we have to understand in greater detail how the competition within capitalist society is going to play out along a number of dimensions, and why the evolutionary approach isn't going to work, and necessarily a certain kind of revolution has to happen. I've got a quotation here. Let me read that to you from Marx here, just about this point about why we have to have a revolution. We cannot have an evolution if we're going to bring about socialism. Quote, "The weapon of criticism," that is to say, pausing for a moment, just understanding the internal logic of capitalism and how it oppresses the people in the proletariat and enables the rich to get richer. Just understanding this theoretically is not going to be enough. The weapon of criticism cannot, of course, replace criticism by weapons. Right? Material force must be overthrown by material force. But theory also becomes a material force as soon as it is gripped by the masses. So the Marxists are arguing it has to be a revolution based on material forces. It can't simply be that we just understand and wait for things to play out. So let's have a little bit closer look at how the class conflict plays out, the roles that politics play, the role that perhaps unions play, and the role that religion plays in the ongoing battle between the emerging socialist class and the reactionary capitalist class in this class conflict. All right, so let me erase temporarily socialism and erase again temporarily the revolution, and talk in a little fuller detail about the nature of the class conflict, in part to see why a revolution is necessary, but also what particular battles have to be fought in order to bring the revolutionary fervor out and make it successful. All right, suppose we have this class conflict here. One more moderate response is to say, yes, all of this is true, say, and there are many socialists who will agree with this analysis up to this point here, but argue that a revolution is not necessarily the case. We don't need to be revolutionary. We don't need to talk about bombs and overthrowing governments and so forth. What we can do is work within the system, the natural evolution of the system, and bring about a socialist system through peaceful means. So, for example, what we might do is say, unionize. Why don't we, within the capitalist system, organize the proletariat? They have the same economic interests. They're now largely urbanized. They know each other. They work together. They can understand that they're all in the same situation. They may not be highly educated, but nonetheless we should be able to get enough educated, strategic thinking union leaders, and we will organize by means of number and use the sheer numbers, right, of the workers that we have as a bargaining tool in our ongoing negotiations with the capitalists. So we want shorter working hours, we want higher pay, we want days off, we want these kinds of benefits, right, and so forth. There is a way within the capitalist system of getting those through negotiation. There are any number of negotiation tactics that are possible, but certainly selling in bulk, since the capitalists are buying in bulk, right, they're buying the wage labor in large quantities here, that should give some bargaining power to the proletariat through their union representatives here, right, so to speak. Now the Marxists will say, all right, that's fine, and there are any number of Marxists who were willing to work with unions in order to organize the unions, but the Marxists argue that by themselves, unions are not going to get very far. Right? What will typically happen here is the protracted union negotiations that come up every 5 years or every 7 years or so. We have a brand new contract. The capitalists and the union leaders will bargain, and there might be some concessions from the capitalists to the unions, but it's going to be marginal concessions. There you are, you're making $1.50 a day now. Okay, fine, you talked us into $1.90 a day. Look at that, you're getting a 40-cent a day raise. That seems like a big chunk of money. That's over 25% raise, and so the proletariat are going to be happy with that. But essentially, that's not going to change the conditions of the proletariat, because the capitalists are still being very profitable. As a class, they're still being profitable, and their children are still getting the better educations. And while the proletariat then get their 25% raise, nonetheless, everything that they buy then ends up being more expensive, because the capitalists just pass on the increase in wages to the consumers, and the proletariat are the largest number of consumers. So over time, the gains that the unions get are not going to economically benefit the proletariat significantly. Now, there's a closely related point here. That was to say, one thing that can come out of union organization and organizing the proletariat is not strictly economic. What we can do is use that as a launching pad toward having members of the proletariat, perhaps people who have put some time in union organization, run for political office. Most of the capitalist systems also have various kinds of democratic and republican institutions. They've extended the franchise to huge numbers of people. So perhaps the road is not simply through bargaining in the capitalist marketplace, but through politics. So why don't we use democracy as our tool of advancing the interests of the proletariat? After all, the proletariat, again, are the huger number, right, by far. And so if they're in a position to vote, and democracy institutionalizes the policy of majority rule, in most voting districts, the proletariat are going to be the majority, so they should be able to elect representatives who are sympathetic to their economic interests, who can then pass legislation that is favorable to the proletariat, or perhaps take away various kinds of legislation that have been put in place that are favorable to the bourgeoisie. Well, again, the Marxists will say that's fine, and there can be some value to all of this, but again, they don't think that this is going to be very effectual in the long run. On the one hand, they're going to argue that in a democratic system, elections are very expensive to run, and so it's still the case that the members of the bourgeoisie have greater amounts of wealth at their disposal, and so they're in many cases going to be able rather to outspend any given proletariat, or member of the proletariat who runs. Of course, the counter-argument to that is to say, well, then unions, of course, are collecting membership dues from the proletariat, so collectively they should have a great deal of economic muscle to be able to put behind a given election, and so they should be able to get some members elected to Parliament or elected to Congress, right, and so forth. And then that very well might be true, but it's going to be a certain amount of time. It might be a generation, right, or 2 generations, the Marxists will point out, until there's a critical mass of people who get elected to Parliament or to Congress, right, in the United States. So again, it's a very slow process. It's not a process that's going to guarantee success. There's also a problem that any number of members of the proletariat who then do get elected to political office, they might be co-opted by the system. They like all the perks of being in Parliament, right, and so on. And so they cut all sorts of deals. You know, democracy is very messy, and in many cases it's deals cut under the table or in various kinds of back rooms. There's no guarantee that the elected representatives from the unions or directly from the proletariat are going to remain true to their class comrades. It's also the case that if you look at the democratic or republican structures in most of the capitalist countries, there are built-in checks against democracy. So suppose we do after a generation or 2 succeed in getting a majority of representatives in, say, Parliament to be sympathetic to the interests of the proletariat. They then start passing legislation that is sympathetic to the proletariat. Well, that legislation gets through Parliament, right, or gets through Congress, but then if you take the American context, then it has to go to the Senate. And then who is in control of the Senate? Well, there are various kinds of constitutional restrictions on who can be a member, right, of the Senate, and the argument then is going to be most of the people who are senators are representatives of the bourgeoisie, and they might allow a few pieces of legislation to get through, but anything that's actually genuinely threatening to the capitalist status quo is simply going to be vetoed by the Senate. Or then if we say, well, then we just do the same thing with respect to the Senate, it can then be vetoed by the president, right? And then, of course, if it gets passed and it gets put into law, there's no necessity that the executive branch of government is actually going to act on the basis of the law. It can be shelved. And then there's the Supreme Court, and there are going to be various legal challenges, right, to the law and so forth. So the argument then is that from the Marxist perspective, that route is, there's no guarantees of success. In fact, there's a chance that the whole system is going to be stretched out for such a long period of time that you're just going to end up with a muddled, mixed economy. Capitalism will be forced to make certain sorts of compromises, but the underlying nature of the system is not going to change. Now, the Marxists will also argue that aside from trying to solve the problem economically through this and trying to solve the problem politically through this, the class conflict also plays out ideologically, and there's another major weapon that the capitalists have at their disposal that works to the advantage of the bourgeoisie and against the proletariat, and that weapon is religion. that religion, from the Marxist perspective, is not simply a false set of beliefs. The Marxists are materialists, so they're on principle atheist. Religion, though, is a social institution, that's reflecting a certain set of underlying economic interests. And what we should find then in the capitalist economies is that religion is serving to rationalize, justify, and empower underlying economic capital interests. So religion is a tool that the capitalists will use in order to forestall any evolution toward socialism, and it's certainly something that they will use to prop up the capitalist institutions and even cause members of the proletariat to think that their better interests actually lie with capitalism rather than in evolving socialism. All right, so what does all of that mean as a set of assertions there? What is the nature of religion in capitalist society, and how does it serve as a cover or as a rationalization or as a prop that justifies a capitalist social structure? All right, religion then is a tool of the capitalists to maintain their control and to stop what the Marxists see as the proper evolution or revolution of society toward socialism. Now, the broader claim that the Marxists made, we discussed earlier, is that economics is the fundamental causal force for all of society, and so religion is an offshoot or secondary consequence, or a way in many cases of making abstract and instantiating in ideological trappings what's really going on in the underlying economic forces, and of course providing a rationale and a second level justification for it. Now, we looked at that in the context of earlier societies, tribal economies, agriculturally based economies, and so forth. How does that thesis play out if we look at more complicated societies such as feudalism and then modern capitalism and so on? All right, well, let's go back and look at feudalism, as a political economic structure here. And we say, all right, what is the structure of feudalism as a political economy? Well, at the top of the heap, we have the king. Okay. And then below the king, under feudalism, we have another class that has a few more people in it. That's the aristocracy. So we have a whole bunch of aristocrats in here. The king plus all of the aristocrats, of course, there's some variation depending on the feudal society, but always less than 10% of the population overall. Now, you might then have a larger number of people who are skilled craftsmen in the various guilds, and they will have a less honored position than the aristocrats, but nonetheless they have some esteem in the society. But then what you do have in the society is a huge rest of the population, and that is the peasantry. Okay. All right, so this is the political structure from bottom to top, and it's also the economic structure. The king is the wealthiest, the one who controls all of the material forces of production, and so on all the way down. So we have a strictly hierarchical structure. Now, this is feudalism, and if we take Western feudalism and we ask when feudalism was dominating European history, that 1,000-year period roughly from the fall of the Roman Empire to the Renaissance, what was the dominant religious structure of the time? And they say, well, it was Christianity, but it was a specific form of Christianity that we now know as Catholicism. Of course, at that point, there was no split between Protestants and Catholics, so it was just Christianity from their perspective. But what is the intellectual, political, economic, and so forth, social structure that's built into the Catholic Church? And they would say, well, at the top, we have a pope. And then below the pope, he is the one who speaks directly with God. We have a few cardinals. And then there are, of course, some other degrees. There are archbishops and bishops, and so forth. But we'll just say down here, essentially we have all of the lay priests, keeping the social structure relatively simple here. But then below the priests, what we have is, again, the broad mass of the population, and that is the laity. Okay. So what we have then here is economics, right, and religion, right, or political economy and religious philosophy on this side here. And the Marxists will say it's no accident that the structure is exactly the same. We have the same hierarchical structure here. In this case, all political and economic power starts at the top and flows down. Here, all intellectual and moral power starts at the top and flows down. And what is the purpose, right, of all of this structure here? Well, it is to partly make real, right, in the minds of the laity every time they show up in church on Sunday morning or for any particular service. It always has a religious investiture to it. So it's to make real to them this more abstract and in some cases distant structure, right, that is over here. It's get them used to the idea of hierarchy and that they're at the bottom of the heap and they're expected to do what their betters tell them, right, higher up. But also it provides a rationalization and a justification, right, for the political and economic structure. Because if you think, for example, of the ritual that we go through every time a new king, right, comes to power, right, what happens is the Pope shows up or a cardinal shows up or whoever the highest religious official in the area who can be brought in for the ceremony, that person then takes a crown and places it on the head of the king. So if the Pope is supposed to be speaking for God right here on earth and the Pope is assigning this crown to the king, then the message that religion is providing to the political and economic structure is one of religious justification, right? It's saying to the peasants and the laity, right, who are in attendance, you should obey the king just as you should obey God. Now, of course, the king is using political muscle and economic muscle to enforce his will, and the purpose of the religion in this case is to add religion's theological and moral muscle, right, to the mix. Okay. So that then is an example of what is driving the ship really is political and economic power. The religion is a second order window dressing and rationalization, right, for a fundamental structure here. Okay, so that's the Marxist explanation in a nutshell for religion under feudalism and how it fits that theoretical model. Now, feudalism then gives way over the course of a couple of centuries to capitalism. And what's the nature of capitalism? Well, there are lots of arguments that the capitalists have with the feudalists over political and economic issues. Capitalists are arguing everybody should be equal under the law as opposed to being hierarchical under feudalism. The capitalists are arguing everybody should be free rather than being bound to a certain sorts of classes, right, and so forth. And so that debate occurs at the political and economic level. But the Marxists will point out that it's not an accident, right, historically, that as capitalism is mounting a major challenge to feudalism, within religion, Protestantism is giving a radical challenge to Catholicism. So we have, at the same time, there's a transition from the religion of feudalism, Catholicism, to a more modern, right, approach to religion that is Protestantism. The economic battles and political battles are going on at the same time. Now, suppose we just say, or couch the terms of the debate rather in theological terms. We say, well, what are the Protestants and the Catholics going back and forth about us? And so we get into all those Reformation and Counter-Reformation issues. And we can say that one of the issues, for example, is the debate over whether Scripture, right, or the Bible should be available to the masses in their vernacular languages or whether Scripture should only be published in Latin. And there are any number of very nasty battles between Protestant Catholics over this particular issue, of course. For example, in England, there were English translations, right, of the Bible that started to appear shortly after the Reformation took place in the 1520s or 30s or so. And those translations were illegal, right? King Henry VIII at that time was still a good Catholic. William Tyndale was the publisher of one of the early translations. All of the king's horses and all the king's men went after Tyndale. They rounded up as many of the copies of this English translation of the Bible as they could and burned them. Tyndale was forced to flee to the continent. He remained in hiding for a number of years, but he was eventually tracked down. He was brought back to England and executed, right, for a form of heresy. Now, what's the argument here? Well, Tyndale, as an early Protestant, is arguing that people should be able to read Scripture, right, for themselves, anybody who's literate, and the Protestants are very big on everybody learning how to read and having basic literacy so that they can read Scripture, so that they can have a right relationship with God. And so it's important then to take the Bible, which is only available in Latin right up to this point, and translate it into English so that the people can do so. That is to say, everybody should have equal access to this literature, and everybody should be free to read it and interpret it for themselves, so that they can be responsible for their own soul and getting in relation properly with God, so to speak. And the Catholic counter-argument on theological grounds is to say, well, you know, something like the following: religion is very difficult. If we just let any old yokel read Scripture for himself, then people are bound to get lots and lots of it wrong, in which case their souls are going to be imperiled. And also there's going to be all kinds of divisions, because once the cat is out of the bag and we say anybody can read Scripture and anybody's interpretation is as good as anybody else's, right, so to speak, then people are going to disagree with each other, and all of the social cohesion of Christendom is going to fall apart, and we're just going to have a whole bunch of bickering factions within religion. And so it's much better if we entrust the proper interpretation of Scripture to authorities who are well-trained, well-educated, well-versed in the tradition of scriptural authority. And on the behalf of Christians every way, we present to them an authorized, right, interpretation. So that then is to say, it's proper, right, that we have everybody kept together in a social group, and that we have a division of labor, intellectually speaking, that we have a specially trained hierarchy, right, a class of individuals whose job is to look after the soul, right, of all of Christendom, and appropriately to interpret Scripture for them. And so the laity shouldn't be reading Scripture in their own right. Instead, the priests, when they go to school and at seminary, they will get the proper interpretation. They will deliver it to the laity, and then people higher up in the hierarchy will sort out proper interpretation. All right. Now that, of course, is to couch the battle between Protestants and Catholics in theological terms, right? This debate between hierarchy and equality, being bound to a given centralized interpretation versus being free to make your own interpretation, right, in strictly religious terms. But what the Marxists, right, will want to argue is that really the debate between the Protestants and the capitalists is not over theological matters. It's not fundamentally over theological matters. That's a second-order manifestation of more fundamental social forces at work. What we have in the transition from feudalism to capitalism is a new, right, ideology and a new set of economic forces giving rise to that ideology that makes the individual central, that sees the individual as equal to all other individuals and wants to make the individual free. Religious matters are simply one manifestation, right, of that underlying set of economic, right, imperatives. So what happens then as feudalism's hold weakens, that makes space for capitalism, and then capitalism, right, proceeds, right, in its economic way to reshape all of society's institutions, including religious institutions, in its own vision, right, so to speak. And so the development of Protestantism with the development of capitalism from the Marxist perspective makes perfectly good sense. Now what we then have is a evolved religion, right, that is serving the same function from the Marxist perspective that all religions serve, right? It is to justify and make manifest, right, to the broad mass of people what capitalism's core institutions are. And certainly within Protestantism, as Protestantism comes to be the dominant religion in the capitalist nations, right, of the world, right, the gospel of equality and the gospel of liberty become, right, all important in that particular situation. But then as this economic logic plays out from the Marxist perspective, as the class conflict becomes stronger, as the antagonism between the classes becomes more marked, as the relationship between the two becomes more hostile, the ways in which religion is used, right, by capitalism in order to continue to maintain its grip on power becomes a little bit darker. And so what we would then say is, and I need to put a question mark here, right, is that from the capitalist perspective, religion, right, under capitalism, comes to play an accommodating role in the following kinds of way. We take all of the members of the proletariat and we encourage them to be religious. We herd as many of them as we possibly can into church on Sunday. They've been working hard all week for minimum wages in subpar conditions, having to do what the boss tells them. They feel a certain amount of resentment. They might feel a certain amount of anxiety. Perhaps as democracy's institutions are progressing, perhaps as union institutions are progressing, their class consciousness is emerging, and so they're feeling a certain amount of anger, right, at their oppression, right, in their situation. But what is the central message, right, that they hear when they show up in church, right, on Sunday mornings, as the preacher, right, or the priest gets up and delivers the sermon to them? Well, they hear a large number of things, but certainly a large subset of those number of things has to do with certain economic, right, messages that are built into the Christian religion. Right, they will be told, for example, that blessed are the meek, right? Blessed are the poor. Now, what's the point of herding large numbers of meek people and poor people into a church and telling them that they are the blessed people? Well, the point has to be to give some sort of consolation to them, right, for their condition. They certainly don't feel like they're blessed. As far as they're concerned, their earthly existence is one of working really hard in subhuman conditions for subpar wages through an SOB, right, boss, and they don't see any hope of that improving in their lives or in the lives of their children. And so what religion does then is telling them that they are blessed, not in the here and now, but that they will nonetheless get their rewards in the afterlife, right, when they go to heaven. Now, who really believes that, right, the Marxists will say? And could this not simply be a calculated political and economic move to take the unrest of the masses and use religion as a way of mollifying the masses, keeping the masses in their place? Because to the extent that the masses believe that there is a heaven and that the mark of their being worthy of getting into heaven is the extent to which they suffer and do their duty while they're here on earth, then that is going to lead them, when they leave church, not to be so revolutionary, not to be upset. They'll have a consolation prize. That'll get them through another week, and so forth. And of course, they hear not only blessed are the meek, they also hear woe to them that are rich. So to the extent that while they feel a certain amount of resentment to those capitalists who are living the good life, right, economically speaking, the same sermon tells them that those rich people, right, are going to burn in hell. It will be easier for a camel, rather, to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. Now, a variety of interpretations of that, but one fairly straightforward interpretation that's prevalent is to say camels don't pass through the eyes of needles, rich men therefore don't get into heaven. So if you are interested in your soul, your immortal soul, and what's going to happen to you in the afterlife, you better not be interested in becoming a rich kind of person. In fact, instead of feeling envious toward the rich people who are seemingly living the good life, you should actually feel pity for them because they're going to burn in hell. The love of money is the root of all evil, right? So to the extent that you feel desperate in your economic circumstances and you really feel that you want to have a better life for yourself economically, be aware that that's to go down the wrong road. You shouldn't be thinking in those terms, right? So stay away from monetary interests and so forth. To the extent that you feel oppressed, right, repressed, that various kinds of injustices are done to you by the nature of an economic system that is cruelly, right, oppressing you, in particular individuals, right, who are doing the same sort of thing, rather than rising up, overthrowing them, giving them grief, giving them a hard time, threatening any sort of material damage, what you should be doing is turning the other cheek, forgiving, right, those who trespass, right, against you. Now the point then is, right, from the Marxist perspective, that again what we have is religion serving the interests, right, of the dominant economic structure, right, that happens to be in place. In this case here, the religious messages that they're singling out that have an economic component all have a particular focus in mind, a particular tactical purpose, right, in mind. That is, on the one hand, to give a consolation prize, right, an illusory, right, consolation prize to those who are on the short end of the economic stick. It's to give them a sense that their envy, right, is misplaced and should be otherwise directed, that it's proper for them and it's noble for them to accept their suffering and to forgive those who seem to be getting better at them. And so, of course, what they are then is going to do, right, during the whole of their lives, to the extent that they believe in this religious system, is be sheep-like. They will not be revolutionary. They will not rise up and demand, right, what is rightfully theirs against this oppressive economic system. In the Marxist way of putting it, it's a direct quote from Karl Marx: religion is the opium, right, of the masses, or sometimes translated, religion is the opiate, right, of the masses, right. Religion is a drug. It's an intellectual drug, and what the drug does is it makes people more placid, it makes them more easily to control. Right? So therefore, religion is a tool that is being used to keep the masses in their place. Democracy is a way also of slowing down the progress of the masses. The unions also are serving the same sort of way. So what we have is economic institutions, political institutions, and religious institutions. None of them are going to, from the Marxist perspective, solve the conflict between the classes that exist between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And so what the Marxists want to argue, therefore, is this whole evolutionary, right, route, right, towards socialism is not going to work. All of these ultimately are just going to serve the interests of the status quo. What we need is harsher measures, and rather than evolution, we need a revolution. Okay, and I've got a quotation here from Marx. Quote, "There is only one means to curtail, simplify, and localize the bloody agony of the old society and the bloody birth pangs of the new. Only one means: the revolutionary terror." So necessarily it has to be a revolution. What we need, right, is a set of individuals who are able to see the conflict between the classes, right, for what it is. To recognize that nonetheless many of the people, even those who are on the receiving end of the pathologies of the given society, that many of those individuals, their energies are going to be co-opted. They'll be co-opted by unions, they'll be co-opted by the democratic process, they will come to believe various sorts of religious institutions. So what has to happen is a small number, right, of individuals have to realize the class conflict for what it is, not be co-opted by these various other institutions instead, but rather take a leadership role in bringing about the revolution that is going to overthrow the established capitalists, all of the politicians, right, who are in their pockets, and all of the religious leaders who are coming along with the window dressing that make everything pretty and so on. Now the question then is going to be, where are we going to get this committed number of revolutionary leaders who are going to be able to lead the proletariat in the direction of the new society, the moral society that is going to be socialism here? And the argument has to be, and it is, right, in Marxism, that if we are going to get the revolutionary leaders, we have to get them before they are conditioned by the existing system. If we go back to the environmental determinism argues that people are born more or less tabula rasa, plastic, to be shaped by the environment into which they are born. If people are born into capitalist society, then to the extent that they are shaped by capitalism's institutions, they are going to come to believe in various respects, capitalism's institutions. They're going to believe in the capitalism's rhetoric about equality and liberty, and aren't those wonderful things? And isn't private property and competition delightful? And yes, maybe there are some difficult issues, and in a nice way, we're working with the unions to develop various reforms as we go along here. And doesn't democracy, right, give people warm, fuzzy feelings, and isn't religion necessary for the moral fabric of society and to give people, right, hope and so forth? All of those things are things that capitalism conditions young people to believe right from day one, through 1,000 different cultural institutions. So what we then need, if we're going to develop the revolutionary cadre, or that small number of individuals who are going to be able to bring about the revolution, is we're going to need to get to young people before they have been conditioned by the capitalists and the capitalists' manifold powerful institutions at their disposal. And there are then going to be a number of ways that the Marxists will argue that we have to do this, but certainly education is going to be a central one, because obviously in education we get people when they're young, we get them before they are formed very significantly, and we have access to them for a large number of hours every day, a large number of days every week, and a large number of weeks every year. So it's necessarily going to be through education, right, that the cadre of revolutionaries, right, inspired by Marxism as a philosophy, are going to come into existence, and then by the time they are mature and in a position to take the reins of leadership, be the ones who bring about the revolution. To turn to Marxist education in practice, I think a time-relative judgment is called for in discussing what is required of us as Marxist educators. Currently, we're in a capitalist system. The Marxists hold capitalism has an internal logic that is going to lead to a revolution. The proletariat will rise up and overthrow the bourgeois exploiters. There will then be a transition phase called the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then out of that transition stage, socialism or communism will emerge, and that will be the ultimate stage of human economic development. But the institutional structures are very different in each of those systems, and so even if we are committed Marxist teachers or Marxist educators setting up institutions, what exactly our role is in bringing about or maintaining Marxism is going to be different depending on the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So let's start with the current system. From the Marxist perspective, the current capitalist system is an immoral system, it's an exploitative system, it's a system that alienates the workers from their products. It's one that allows the rich, those who own property, those who are in a position to glean profits from various enterprises, to live off the backs of the workers and to unjustly allocate to themselves inappropriate amounts of money. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer and poorer. Now in this situation then, as Marxist educators, we're not in a position to institutionalize socialism directly, or in many cases given who has hired us to be institutionalizing ourselves Marxist curricula and so forth. So what we then need to do is either be subversively critical and smuggle in a certain amount of anti-capitalist instruction into our classrooms, or to the extent that we do have some leeway as Marxist educators, maybe we're professors with tenure or high school teachers with tenure, we can be more overt about this. But nonetheless, the point is that as Marxist educators, we believe that the current system is an evil, immoral, exploitative system, and our primary job is to critique that system. So our job is to be critical and to mount various critiques to our students, to engage our students in the critical enterprise of coming to understand the true nature of the system in which they live in. So what then will be necessary is for us to criticize as much as possible all of the existing institutions of power of contemporary society, the current political system, the current economic system, that is to say, from speaking from the American context, the politicians who are controlling the power in Washington, D.C. or in the various state capitals, to show them as lining their own pockets or augmenting their own power at the expense of other people, or the fat cats on Wall Street, or whoever happens to be the leading capitalists of the day, to show them as rich individuals who have acquired their wealth at the expense of the workers under them. Anything that we can use institutionally in terms of structural criticisms is perfectly legitimate. We also should use any personal analyze scandals, if we can have examples of politicians acting badly or capitalists acting badly, that will help concretize in our students' minds the evils of the current system. And at the same time, we need to play up the struggles and the difficulties and the problems experienced by the underclass in society, the struggles that the working class is having, individuals who are poor or who are otherwise economically marginalized by the system, to develop our students' sympathy with and a sense of identification with people in those particular classes. And of course, when we're speaking about capitalism's institutions such as private property, the profit motive, competition, and so forth, we need to characterize all of those systematically in negative terms as involving zero-sum benefits for some at the expense of others. All right, in addition to that, we should try as much as we possibly can then to inculcate in our students a more socialistic ethos or a communalistic ethos. If competition is bad, then we will try to train our students to be cooperative. If profit seeking is bad, then we'll train our students to be charitable, right, and so forth. If private property, the fundamental institution, is the institution that enables both profit seeking and competition to come into existence, then we have to inculcate in our students a much more communal ethos, the notion that all property and all assets should be owned by everyone and shared by everyone in an equal fashion, and so forth. And of course, we also need to be critical not simply about the political mechanisms of capitalism and the economic institutions of capitalism, but also its ideological superstructure, with particular focus on religion. We as Marxist educators, to the extent that we are capable in a capitalist system, need to be critical of the role that religion plays in propping up and justifying that capitalistic system. Now, as materialists, we as Marxist educators are going to believe, of course, that all religions are false. Their belief in spirits and ghosts and immortal souls and supernatural dimensions on metaphysical grounds, all of that is out. But more to the point, we're going to be interested in criticizing the way in which religion can be used by the current powers that be to prop up their current system. So we show religion as being a set of beliefs that leads people not to place much stock in their lives in the here and now, as a system that tells them that their job is to be patient and forgiving and not to be interested in money, and to hope for a better life in the afterlife, all of that pie in the sky. Blessed are the meek, your day will come as long as you are a good boy or a good girl and do what your current masters tell you to do. All of that needs to be exploited. We need to, if religion is the opiate of the masses, we need to get the masses off of drugs, get them angry, get them worked up about their actual material circumstances. So if we can get our students off of drugs, that is to say, if we can get them not to be co-opted by current prevailing rather religious beliefs, if we can get them to see ruthlessly and clearly the exploitative nature of the current system, not to buy into all of its propaganda about being committed to liberty and equality and democracy and so forth, then what we'll be able to do is our job in developing a cadre of young people who will then become committed to the revolution, committed to developing a Marxist society at some point in the future. Now, of course, the standard criticism that's going to be launched against us is that we are indoctrinating students, that we're not being fair to both sides and so forth. And the Marxists will, in accordance with their underlying philosophy, say, well, of course we're indoctrinating students, but that's what everybody does. Marxists, we recall, are determinists. They are environmental determinists. Students are born into a certain kind of cultural context, and they are simply molded and shaped by their cultural context to believe whatever ideology is prevailing in that cultural context. So that's what every cultural context throughout history always has done, and that's exactly what the capitalists are doing with their ideology right now. So of course it's conditioning, but all education is conditioning. All raising the young to be a certain kind of social being is conditioning. But currently we as Marxist educators believe that the most powerful conditioning agents are the capitalist ones with the backing up of religion, particularly Christian religion in contemporary times. So yes, we are conditioning, but our job is to be forthright and explicit about the conditioning and to be better conditioners if we're going to develop the kinds of students who are going to be able to overcome all of the counter-conditioning that's going on in society that wants to lead them in a direction of being cogs in the capitalist machine. All right, suppose we as Marxist educators are successful and the revolution comes, the current capitalist system is overthrown, and we're now in a position to start building a socialist society. Our job as educators changes significantly at this point, in part because now the education system will be entirely state-run, and it will be state-run by politicians and other powers that be who are committed to Marxism as the ruling ideology, and so we will have the full support and backing of the system to bring about and to do our jobs in helping to bring about a fully socialistic system here. However, the transition from capitalism to socialism, according to Marxism, is not going to be overnight. It's certainly going to be at least the work of a generation, and so there's going to be a transition stage that classical Marxism calls the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's to say the proletariat, that is to say the workers and those who are advocates of the workers' cause will be the ones who are running the show, but they will have to run the show in a dictatorial fashion. And the dictatorship is necessary because we're still a society that is largely split. We do have a certain number of people who are committed to the socialist cause, and every day there are more young people who are being born who have not existed under the prior capitalist system. But in this transition stage, we still have a huge number of people in the population, perhaps, and even likely a majority of the population who grew up under the old system, that is to say, who grew up under capitalism, who grew up under a religiously based society as well. And so those individuals are still either wholly or at least partially conditioned to still think in terms of capitalism and religion. So during this transition stage, we're going to need to exercise in a top-down fashion an education system that, on the one hand, deals with those people who are still younger and not yet or haven't yet been conditioned by capitalism. They are tabula rasa. We can shape them how we wish to create the new socialist man. But at the same time, we're going to have an education system that takes into account those who were earlier conditioned by and may still be committed to the earlier system of capitalism and religion. Now, of course, one solution, and the most ruthless solution that some Marxists will advocate, is simply to get rid of entirely anybody who is beyond a certain age on the grounds that those people cannot be trusted. It's not likely that they can be reconditioned, or that given their age, it's not worth the expense of trying to recondition them. And so we can simply get rid of, and I'll just use that as a euphemism now, get rid of the entire older generation or anybody who seems not to be signed up on the cause. And in that case, we certainly will need to use dictatorial methods in order to get rid of them, and then we can focus entirely on the tabula rasa younger generation and teach them about socialism in an appropriate kind of fashion. Now, there is going to be one delicate issue. In the older generation, you're going to have a large number of people who are parents, and certainly in the younger generation, we're going to have all of the children. And one of the things that is common in pre-socialist societies is an importance placed on the family unit. But of course, the family unit is something that comes out of individualism, right? I, as an individual, choose someone to be my mate, and she, right, or he, depending on what my sex is, has also chosen me, right? We as individuals have created certain children, and we see them as our children. We don't see them as society's children, and we prefer our children to other people's children. And so we're operating on an individualistic, self-interested, private basis here. But of course, from the Marxist perspective, that is entirely wrong. We should not see ourselves as individuals who are making our own choices about our mates or who have special relationships to our children. We're all part of a larger community, all part of society. And so these bourgeois notions about the importance of family is something that we're going to have to overcome in the dictatorship of the proletariat stage. And it's going to be fairly pointedly directed because, of course, many of the parents are going to believe in some sort of a capitalist market-oriented system, or they might believe in old-fashioned liberal democracy, or they themselves might be religious. And if we then are, on the one hand, bringing students into schools and trying to teach them about socialism, but then they go home at the end of the day and they learn all of these countervailing methods, there's no guarantee that they're going to listen to us more than they're going to listen to their parents. They might then, at the very least, be confused, and then it's just going to delay the amount of time that it takes us to create a generation of adults who are fully signed on to the socialist program. So one thing that we then might do is, as institute, and this would be a modest Marxist proposal, institute boarding schools where for a significant amount of time, perhaps the entire academic year, students are taken away from their parents and they're sent to boarding schools, and so for the bulk of their childhood they are under our control, in the dictatorial system, and then we might allow to a certain extent some family contact during vacations and summer breaks and so forth. Or of course the more ruthless regime will be simply to break down the family structures altogether, to get students past the notion of thinking that they have special links that are private affections to particular individuals who are their parents, not allow any contact with the new generation and the old generation, and then that will speed up the process of developing a new generation of socialist individuals. All right, now imagining a successful future from the Marxist perspective, we've successfully mounted a revolution. We've successfully gone through that transition phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Suppose optimistically we're now a generation into the revolution, and we now have an entire cohort of young people who from day one have been educated in Marxist socialist system. And they're now adults, and so the whole society, or at least the dominant number of people among the older people and among the young people who are continually being born into the society, everything then is essentially Marxist. Now we can talk about what Marxist education will be in a fairly pure sense. And I want to organize Marxist education under three headings, and there are and have been some variations among Marxist theoreticians and in the dozen or more societies in the course of 20th century history and now 21st century history that have been more or less Marxist. There have been some variations here. But the commonalities strike me as falling rather under three headings. The first heading is, for good philosophical reasons, a strong emphasis on physical education. This makes perfectly good sense. Since the Marxists philosophically are materialists, it makes sense that they would place a great deal of emphasis on physical education. So there's a great deal of calisthenics, a great deal of learning by doing, a great deal of physical activity. And a certain amount of this involves simply a matter of physical health. If the human being primarily is a physical being, then a concern with physical health is going to be important here. Also, the Marxists will put a great deal of emphasis typically on a certain amount of military training, and military activities are very vigorously physical, of course. The Marxist regimes, right, historically are in a world where there's lots of other political regimes in which they're in competition with, and so they're well aware that military might is an important part of maintaining one's position right in the world. And then, of course, most of the Marxists believe that physical labor, or a labor theory of value, or that the kind of work that's the basically productive kind of work, involves a great deal of physical labor. And so physical education that will train one for that kind of physical work is very important. So a significant amount of physical work, physical health, physical activity is built into and one of the three pillars of Marxist education. And if you perhaps have seen video clips or pictures in books from Marxist regimes, the standard kind of clip is students at various points in the day or during the week, all wearing uniforms, doing group calisthenic activities. A great deal of that physical activity, but it's everyone's wearing uniforms to give them a sense that they are not isolated individuals with their own style, and their competition between individuals for how they look, but also doing the exercises as part of a group so that one gets one senses oneself rather as being a part of a larger group in all of one's activities. All right, second pillar of Marxist education is economic and physical work training. The Marxists believe, of course, again philosophically, that economics is the fundamental science, the mother science upon which all the rest of society's superstructure is built upon. How we make a living in our society, as in any society, is the most fundamental thing. And so a major part of Marxist education has to be job training, career training. And so there will be a great deal of agricultural training, agriculture being a very labor-intensive kind of economic pursuit, and a great deal of technical training. Most Marxists believe in a kind of combination of agricultural training and technical training, and certainly at the early ages before we start segregating students into career paths, they should know something about agriculture, where their food comes from. They should know something about basic manufacturing and technological pursuits so that they know where the various articles of manufacture come from. And we're also looking as educators to see where their aptitudes might lie so that when we start tracking them, we can track some in a more agricultural direction and others in a more technical and industrial direction. But nonetheless, all students should have some basic agricultural education and some basic industrial/technological education as well. They should understand these things not merely theoretically, but they should also be able to do these things. They need to be able to do the activities physically, because it is that physical activity that is the source of value, and we want students to be able to do all of these things. The third pillar of Marxist education is a little bit more intellectual. Now, Marxists philosophically are not great believers in human consciousness. They believe that human consciousness, the mind, or whatever we want to call it, the spirit, is an epiphenomenon, or at best a secondary phenomenon based on underlying physical processes. But the Marxists, for the most part, do recognize that, of course, we are conscious beings, and what people think and believe to some extent plays a causal role in how they do act. So it is necessary for there to be some ideological instruction in education as well. And this ideological instruction then will be a certain amount of Marxist political economy, education in how Marxists believe we should think about politics, how Marxists believe we should think about economic matters, a certain amount of Marxist philosophy for students who perhaps might be going on a leadership kind of a track as well. And then also art that will serve a didactic purpose, or literature or movies that serve an instructional purpose in helping students concretize and visualize what it means to be a good socialist. We will certainly teach history as a series of lessons about the bad old days under various other kinds of educational systems, and so forth. So art, literature, history, all of it serves that didactic purpose of ideologically instructing individuals to believe in a Marxist philosophical base. So put those three together, right? Marxist physical education, technological and agricultural instruction, and Marxist ideology. Those three form the basis for Marxist education, both philosophically and in terms of how most, in practice, Marxist educational systems have been instituted in the countries where, to more or less degrees, Marxism has been the ruling ideology. I've one concrete real-life example to read about Marxist education in practice. This involves the education of Kim Jong-il, the current communist leader in North Korea. North Korea, now one of the longest-lived Marxist-inspired states. And it speaks to his education. Quote, Kim Jong-il began studying at Kim Il-sung University in 1960, majoring in Marxist political economy. His minor subjects included philosophy and military science. While at university, he also took production training at Pyongyang Textile Machinery Factory as a road working apprentice and as a worker building broadcasting equipment. Now, from a Marxist perspective, that's perfect, that's beautiful. We have Marxist philosophy, Marxist political economy, military science, actual working in factories, actually working building roads. All of the major buttons here are being pressed. Now, as mentioned before, one very common thing for students in all Marxist classrooms is for students to be wearing uniforms. Uniforms do give one a sense of being part of a group, as part of a social grouping, developing one's sense of being part of a cadre. It takes away any possibility, or certainly lessens the extent to which one can think of oneself as an individual, as unique. And it takes away all of those issues of evaluating people primarily as individuals and all the competition over personal appearances and so forth that can go on. Also, Marxists place a great deal of emphasis on group work. As much as possible, we want students to be working on group projects in social groupings, again, developing them sense that the students in a sense that they are not individuals, that it's not through individual effort primarily, but rather through collective effort that things get done. So, uniforms, group work, and then at the same time, we as teachers are monitoring our students and evaluating our students. Eventually, students will graduate and they will then become part of the society at large. And we do, as much as possible, want to position students to do the kind of work that will be most useful to society. And so we're going to look for students who have certain kinds of aptitudes so that we can direct them toward perhaps military service, towards being farm workers, towards industrial production or engineering, or perhaps those few students who are in a position to have a firm grasp on Marxist political economy and philosophy, those who might go on to assume leadership roles. So there will be a kind of tracking that develops as Marxist education goes on, but nonetheless, even with the tracking, the students will be tracked as groups and they will do their work in groups, and they will have various kinds of uniforms and badges and insignia and so forth that designate their group membership, all the same time making sure that they're working toward a sense of solidarity with society as a whole.